wasn't sure.
It's okay.
I'm going to do some brief introductions, and then I'm going to introduce Dr. Connor, and then she'll give you the cue when to start the video.
Okay, and that's the highlight video, right? Play in the middle. Gotcha.
Yeah. And then we're going to, then after she's done, we're going to go to Dr. Chandler, and then we're going to wrap up. So.
All right, let's see. What time is it? 1:14. All right. So we will start on time. Are we missing anyone for this? I'm looking at let's see, we have Victoria. Mm-hmm. Christians on the line. There's 2 Christians, right? There's another Christian.
Not for this session.
Okay. All right, well, maybe I got an outdated list. All right. Well, if you're not kicking off the video on this session, go ahead and mute your microphone. Okay. And we will begin in 1 minute.
Okay.
And just so I know, will I share my slides for my PowerPoint part? Okay.
Yes. You want to practice that real quick, or just make sure that it comes up, because Christian, I saw his, but I want to make sure I see yours as well. Got it. Thank you.
And you're at Pitt. I went to Pitt too.
I saw that. I was like, we just traded places.
How did that happen?
All right. Victoria, the floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you. So I begin now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the scientific abstract session of the 12th Annual International Conference on Stigma. My name is Vicki Haverman, and I'm the chair of the conference's scientific committee. We'll begin this morning by announcing the Scientific Abstract Award winners. And then afterwards, we'll hear brief oral presentations from our Best Scientific Abstract Award winner and our second place Scientific Abstract Award winner. So let's get started. This year was another competitive year of abstract submissions. The 15 posters presented on the conference portal were selected through a multi-round evaluation process by the scientific committee. There were 4 of us that worked through this. And then from all this fantastic research that was selected for the conference, the committee gave out 3 awards. So the 3rd place Scientific Abstract Award goes to Dr. Brooke West for her research entitled Exploring the Role of Provider Stigma and Discrimination in Drug-Related Maternal Morbidity and Mortality. The 2nd place Scientific Abstract Award goes to Dr. Cayenne Connor for her research entitled The Impact of a Culturally Meaningful Storytelling Intervention on Stigma and Attitudes About Mental Health Treatment. And lastly, the Best Scientific Abstract Award goes to Dr. Christian Chandler for his research entitled Assessing the Impact of Intersectional Enacted Stigma on Psychosocial Syndemic Conditions in a Sample of Black Men who have sex with men engaged in sex work for 6 US cities. So congratulations to all of our award winners. You'll receive your prizes in the mail after the conference. So now we're going to transition to the brief oral presentation by the 2nd place and Best Scientific Abstract Award winners. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2nd place Scientific Abstract Award winner, Dr. Cayenne Connor. She's an associate professor of mental health law and policy at the University of South Florida. Dr. Connor is a licensed clinical social worker by profession. She has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. In addition, she has a master's in social work, a master's in public health with a specialization in minority health and health disparities, and a PhD in social work with postdoctoral training in community psychiatry. Dr. Connor's research investigates the factors that influence disparities in health service utilization and treatment outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities. Her work also examines culturally meaningful approaches to improving behavioral health and reducing stigma. Dr. Connor has received over $3 million in funding for her research on behavioral health disparities. She has 50 publications that speak to the impact of her work, and she has presented at over 45 scientific conferences in the United States and internationally. So please welcome Dr. Cayenne Connor.
Good afternoon. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm very excited about this and excited to have an opportunity to share, even briefly, some of the awesome work that we're doing in this area. So I know I've got 10 minutes. I can tend to be long-winded, so I'm going to do my best to keep this brief. But I'm really excited to present on This Is My Brave, Stories from the Black Community, which was a intervention sort of collaboration between the University of South Florida, as well as This Is My Brave and the Central Florida Behavioral Health Network, to really shine a light on and highlight Black and Brown voices in their experience with mental health, trying to address barriers to mental health service utilization. And ultimately, our goal here was to save lives and to identify strategies that are effective in reducing stigma and encouraging folks to access treatment who need that help. Really quickly, this is our amazing team of folks who worked on this project, and we actually received funding for this work through a special pot of funds on understanding and addressing anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism at the University of South Florida, which was a fund that was developed after the murder of George Floyd, as well as protests around racial equality. And so we were very excited to have an opportunity to use those funds to do something important in our community. Just some really quick background, although I'm sure a lot of us already kind of know this information. But we know that Black Americans are significantly more likely to report persistent symptoms of emotional distress and an increased rate of psychological difficulties. And this higher rate of mental distress has a number of different precipitors, including experiences of discrimination, racism, and prejudice, historical trauma, racial trauma, having difficulty accessing culturally responsive mental health care. And we also know that Black Americans are significantly less likely to access mental health services. And even once those initial barriers are overcome, are significantly more likely to terminate that treatment prematurely. There are a number of factors, and we could spend all day sort of talking about some of these additional challenges and barriers, but among them, stigma has certainly emerged as one of the most powerful and significant and salient barriers to mental health service utilization in the Black community. A recent poll actually found that approximately 63% of African Americans identify mental health issues as a sign of personal weakness or failure, and that seeking mental health services is often seen as not something appropriate in one's community, or certainly a last resort, often occurring after crisis, and after community-based or outpatient services could have been addressed. There are a lot of different approaches that have been researched focusing on how best to combat stigma, protest and education as being additional examples, but contact interventions, sort of personal interactions with an individual who is currently experiencing a similar mental health concern, has been shown to be incredibly effective. However, there's a dearth of sort of culturally focused contact interventions. And storytelling is really unique because this is kind of a culturally sanctioned strategy that allows you to have contact with someone who may be experiencing a mental health condition or has gone through treatment that we believed could have a really powerful impact on the community and could encourage people to have more positive attitudes about seeking services. And we felt that having people share the stories, their stories from a similar demographic, someone that people could relate to, would make this material and this information even more salient and have a greater impact on outcomes. So our real overall question here was, will this culturally based storytelling intervention reduce stigma and improve attitudes about seeking mental health treatment? Again, this was a partnership with This Is My Brave, which is a national organization that produces events focused on stigma reduction. Before the pandemic, this was done largely in person, where this group would travel from city to city and identify individuals within a specific community who wanted to share their story of mental health treatment seeking and resiliency, and would present their experience to a live audience. After the pandemic, these interventions and these shows became virtual, which I think was a neat opportunity as well, because we were able to target a larger geographical area, and we had folks in attendance from all over the world, and were able to capture really amazing stories from Black and Brown individuals from across the United States. So we had these 2 series that aired at the beginning of 2021. We did pre and post surveys with viewers via Qualtrics, as well as did some post-viewing interviews with a random sampling of participants, which I could talk about in questions and answers if folks are interested in learning more about that. Overall, we had 244 individuals who actually participated in the pre and post survey. And we were looking at personal stigma, perceived stigma, internalized stigma, attitudes about seeking mental health treatment, as well as perceived social distance between someone who had a mental health condition. And we included some information, some questions about anti-racism as well. And participants received a $25 gift card for their participation. So now what I really wanted to do was share a highlight from this series so that you could sort of see what we put together and hear a little bit about these amazing stories so that you could better understand the impact that folks had from watching them. So whenever you're ready, we could play that video now. It doesn't sound like the sound is on, or we can't hear it. And I could share it from my screen if it becomes easier to do it that way.
Study psychology, and I would read textbooks like abnormal psychology, and I would look at a picture of a person with mental illness, and it didn't look like me. So I said, oh, I don't have no mental illness. But is there a look? No, anybody can get mental illness. It's a false image of what mental illness looks like. While trying to distract my mind and push out any extreme possible outcome that was playing as a scenario, the phone call came in. My friend is dead. The words rang pain in my ears, and wrapping my head around the news was not something I was capable of doing. Then I learned the details. He wanted to leave as a soldier and jumped into the train tracks and marched to his death. May 28th, 2006, my 15-year-old friend took his own life. A guy who had a rough upbringing and an emotional story, but had the silliest, crooked tooth, infectious smile that always wanted to ensure those around him were happy, took his life, and I could not process this. My first taste of mental health within our community and not recognizing the signs, the fact that there were signs, and even understanding what that means to be emotionally and mentally unwell. This was age 14.
From church skinny ties to flat-billed hats and matching shoes, from finger waves to gumbies, mini froze to dreadlocks, fresh fitted, the freshest of the fresh, ready to grab her hand during couple skate or bring home a report card. On these days, we're all Black boys. All body bags, all filled with holes, all autopsies, all unrecognizable, baptized in sirens and secrets, unaware that others could supersede our skin's darkness. On these days, we're all Black boys, our spirits drifting into the night sky. Nephews, cousins, uncles, aunties, Black boys. On these days, even grandfathers become boys. They stumble back in a time when this narrative was the exact same, when the entire neighborhood had a funeral in the middle of the street for the kid whose name we all knew, mother crying in the backdrop, and Black boys watched other Black boys become asphalt. On these days, even sisters become boys. Only knowing how to teach them how to find the right partner, And when they're stolen, it feels like you're breathing molasses air. Tell them sit on my face. I am bigger than anything coming my way. It's a new day. Now I'm not afraid. So if anyone asks you how I overcame, you can tell them I'm brave.
Thank you so much. Let me pull my slides back up again. Okay. All right. So hopefully that was interesting. Again, that was just a 4-minute clip of what was 2-hour-long segments of stories from a subsection of individuals with this, a variety of different experiences. And one of the neat things about this storytelling intervention was that folks were able to use whatever kind of artistic expression that made sense to them. Monologue, poetry, song. We had some dance, which really spans the scope of Black art. So there was certainly a connection there, and we were incredibly excited about how well these pieces turned out. And we also did some work and some pre and post surveys and interviews with the actual cast from this series, which we're hoping to put forward in another sort of presentation and paper, which were really fascinating about the impact of sharing a story on one's recovery process as well. But excitingly, we had some really great findings, a very diverse sample of viewer participants, which I'll share in our larger presentation later on this week. But we saw significant findings on all of our studied outcomes. We found that overall personal, I apologize for the email dings, personal and perceived stigma was significantly reduced from pre to post series. Attitudes towards seeking mental health treatment significantly improved. Perceived social distance between individuals and others who had a mental health condition was significantly reduced and improved. And feelings of anti-racism significantly improved as well. Importantly, attitudes about mental health treatment improved most for racial and ethnic minority participants. And I'll talk more about this on Thursday, but we saw some really interesting interactions with race, such that although scores on all of these scales improved for everyone, we saw a much more drastic improvement for the racial and ethnic minority participants who watched this series, which really suggested to me the importance of culturally tailored messaging, and that individuals from this community connected uniquely to these stories. They saw themselves in these individuals, and that we believe led to a greater increase in outcomes. So some of our basic implications here: that storytelling can be effective and is a culturally meaningful strategy for reducing stigma and improving attitudes about mental health service utilization. Again, targeting contact interventions for specific communities may enhance their ability to relate to the messages and may have a greater impact on outcomes. Partnering with a large anti-stigma organization like This Is My Brave is also a great strategy. We were able to reach a lot of people, especially in this, post-COVID, if we're in post-COVID yet world. But certainly we need more research to test out these results with larger, more representative samples. And we're actually in the process of doing this, another intervention using these same series, but with a sample of folks who perhaps were not already inclined to view the series before finding out about it. So we recognize that being a limitation, that all of our viewers were intending to watch this series anyway. So they likely had less stigma and had more knowledge about mental health than just a general audience sample. So we're hoping to test this out again with that kind of a neutral sample and see if there are differences in outcomes. So thank you so much for giving me this 10 minutes today. And I look forward to sharing more about this work the rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connor. Wonderful presentation. So now I'm excited to introduce our Best Scientific Abstract Award winner, Dr. Christian Chandler. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of South Florida and stayed there to earn a Master's of Public Health degree with a focus on health disparities and social determinants. Subsequently, Dr. Chandler earned his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in Behavioral and Community Health Sciences. He has since held postdoctoral research fellowships at the University of Pittsburgh and Emory University, and served as a visiting research faculty member of Yale University's Yale University School of Public Health. Dr. Chandler is an incoming assistant professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University. As a social and behavioral health scientist, Dr. Chandler's research focuses on social justice, health equity, and disease prevention among sexual and gender minorities, particularly in communities of color. He has been an invited speaker at several universities, an instructor, published several peer-reviewed articles, and presented his research at professional conferences. His most recent work centers around biobehavioral HIV prevention, sex work engagement, and intersectional stigma. Please welcome Dr. Christian Chandler.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Give me just 1 second to pull up the slides here. All right, so thank you. Again, my name is Christian Chandler, and today we're going to be talking about assessing the impact of intersectional enacted stigma on psychosocial syndemic conditions in the sample of Black men who have sex with men who engage in sex work from 6 US cities. I know that that sounds like a lot, but we're going to get through this together. Okay. So first and foremost, by way of background, I probably don't need to tell this audience very much, but Black men who have sex with men, regardless of how they identify, remain the racial group that's most impacted by HIV acquisition and poor health outcomes along the HIV care continuum, with an estimated 1 in 2 lifetime chance of acquiring HIV if we don't make significant changes to our system. And exchange sex among men, also known as transactional sex, which is a form of sex work, remains an understudied area of research. And the risk category that we call Black men who have sex with men really subsumes lots of groups. And so in order for us to understand what's driving these disparities, rather than looking between groups, we need to look within groups, such as within Black MSM, specifically around the folks who might engage in sex work. Now, literature around male sex workers is growing, and this has a lot to do with the context of sex work, which has been expanding very rapidly. So we've always been able to talk about street sex work, but online and professionalized escorting through apps, and then thinking about online sex work, such as through camming, which has gotten a very large upgrade in the past several years. And then of course, content creation and other subscription services, such as OnlyFans and Just for Fans. Now, we know that some male sex workers experience a constellation of health disparities and biopsychosocial conditions that are at the intersections of both stigma, racism, such as fetishism, violence, and sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. And there's some literature that suggests that Black men who have sex with men might engage in sex work more often based on the contextual as well as structural factors that we've all come to know that are associated with HIV, such as employment, educational opportunities, and issues, especially in urban areas, with things like housing. But before we get into the analysis, I think it's important to ground us in 2 sort of theoretical frameworks. And the first is intersectionality. A lot of people talk about this, but in reality, it's just the framework to explain the interlocking experiences that provide opportunities for privilege and power or discrimination, and it's based on multiple identities, particularly minoritized identities. So things like race, social class, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And so one of our questions was, do experiences of stigma among men who engage in sex work differ from those with no recent history of sex work? And so we wanted to describe the impact of intersectional stigma on those psychosocial outcomes. Now, you may be asking, why psychosocial outcomes? I think that's a great question, which leads us to the second theory, which is syndemic production. And that's 2 or more co-occurring epidemics of biological and ecosocial factors that are mutually reinforcing to worsen health outcomes. That sounds like a lot, but in reality, it's just us trying to link people's lived experiences with their health outcomes. And so in the 1990s, Merrill Singer proposed what he called the SAVA syndemic, or substance abuse, violence, and AIDS. And he said, when these things are together, they mutually reinforce one another, so that even when you're trying to work on one, you can't really make headway because they're so intricately connected to one another. And so syndemics has been used to study HIV outcomes for quite some time in men who have sex with men, including those who are Black. And even though it's primarily individualized, right, it is very helpful in breaking up the monolith that is Black MSM. So we know that a lot of the psychosocial conditions that are most often studied in this are things about mental health, such as depression or anxiety, violence, substance use, and then risk behavior. So that led us to the question of how do intersecting enacted stigmas impact the relationship between sex work engagements and psychosocial syndemic outcomes? First, I'll say this is a secondary data analysis of promoting our worth, equality, and resilience, done from 2014 to 2017. Just under 6,000 men who had sex with men and transgender women were recruited in 2-hour time blocks using time location sampling at official Black Pride events in the 6 cities that you see there. They completed a survey and HIV screening. In this analysis, we have just over 4,400 men who were age 18 and over, reported having sex with a man in the past 12 months, were cisgender males and who identified as Black, including individuals who were multiracial. In terms of the measures, we actually asked men if they had received money, drugs, or some other goods in the past 12 months in exchange for sex. And there's more to that I could speak on. But we also asked about enacted stigma. We used the everyday discrimination scale as a way to repurpose that to talk about enacted stigma. And we asked men if they had experienced this, and they attributed it to their race, sexuality, HIV status, socioeconomic status, or some other stigma. And we considered when men reported 2 or more of those as intersectional stigma. Now, our psychosocial syndemics conditions that we looked at were the moderate to severe depression likelihood using the CESD-10, past your intimate partner violence, physical assault, and then past 3 months poly drug use. Now, we knew going into this that men who engaged in sex work were significantly more likely to report all of these psychosocial syndemics. So we wanted to understand the impact on those. By way of results, I think it's important to note here, this is a multivariable logistic regression that really just, in essence, compares men who engage in sex work to men who had not engaged in sex work. And so when we looked at this, out of that 4,430 men, 5.7% of them, or 254, were men who had engaged in sex work in the past year. And we found that those men were significantly more likely to report enacted stigma in all of the things that we had asked: race, sexuality, HIV status, socioeconomic status, and other. And I want to draw your attention to HIV status, because even though we were controlling for this, statistically, HIV status still had the largest odds ratio, followed by socioeconomic status-based stigma. So, and that kind of supports the literature that some of these economic issues might actually be driving sex work, and they might be very heavily related to that. As a secondary portion of this, we also asked questions specifically around where this took place. And so as you can see here, the biggest thing was in their interactions with law enforcement, but then sadly, and perhaps unsurprisingly or surprisingly, medical and healthcare was next at 3.76. So keep those things in mind as we move forward. We used a structural equation model to look at a mediation analysis, and really what we wanted to understand was how intersectional stigma, seen here as the stigma attribution, you can see those 5 types of stigma, we wanted to understand this relationship between sex work engagement, that red umbrella, to the psychosocial syndemic cluster. So we knew that sex work engagement was associated with these psychosocial syndemic conditions. You can see that there at the top of that bottom line. But there was also a significant indirect effect, and you see that at the very bottom of the slide in italics. So what does that mean? Well, a way to think about this is we see that there are the total effects of the structural equation model, and we see there are the indirect effects. But there's a proportion of this that's impacted by, that's mediated by that intersectional stigma, that latent variable there. And it's pretty high, it's 49%. And you can see that it's a very tight confidence interval from 47 to 50 there. So when we think about this, what this is saying to us is that stigma is major, particularly among folks who are engaged in sex work, over and above Black men who have sex with men, and that it really is a part of this pathway and infects this pathway between sex work and these negative outcomes. So just to recap, because I know we don't have much time here, but Black men who have sex with men experience greater stigma in more places. And even though they talked about all 5 of them, I think it's really important to also think about where this happened. So when we look at law enforcement, think about the intersection of race, sex work, and HIV. And this is part of the reason why there's such a big movement to decriminalize HIV work, to decriminalize being HIV positive and living with HIV, but also about sex work. And so we can see those things coming together through this odds ratio. But also, because this is a status neutral space, we also found this in terms of healthcare. And this may be indicating not just for folks that are living with HIV, but also for folks who might be experiencing things like PrEP stigma inside the healthcare system, all before the general public. There was also that significant mediation. And so we know that stigma accounts for a large part of this relationship, and we need to figure out how to best intervene on that behalf. I will briefly say that there are some limitations, and I argue future directions to this data. First, despite the large sample size, the data are cross-sectional. We've done our best in terms of directionality, but at the very least, even though we don't have causality, we know these things are related. And so in a longitudinal analysis, it'd be good to look at this over time. The analysis really only looked at enacted stigma, and we know from Dr. Earnshaw's work that this would be improved if we looked at internalized and anticipated stigma. And because we didn't know how many of these we'd get, we didn't have sex work specific stigma in this, but that is definitely a future line of research, at least for me. And I say all that to say, stigma and its alleviation remain at the heart of addressing HIV disparity issues. We need multi-component and sex-positive interventions, perhaps specifically for sex workers, because we can't achieve ending the HIV epidemic without also addressing stigma. And so with that, I will say thank you, take questions, but I also need to thank the Center for LGBT Health Research, Pitt Public Health, and our community-based organizations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandler. Nice work. So I think we may be at time. So if folks would like to either engage on the portal, if that's okay with both you, Dr. Chandler and Dr. Connor, or in other sessions, that would be wonderful. Just before we go though, I want to let you all know the full poster presentation live session is going to be held on Thursday, November 18th from 11:15 to 11:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you need to do conversions, so please join us at that time. And you can ask all the poster presenters as well as our fantastic researchers here questions about their fascinating research. You can also access the poster presentations on the conference portal prior to the session, so you can kind of come in with your questions ready to go. But yes, thank you all.